Professor Little's keynote address is titled Thriving at Carleton, Why Personality Matters. However, before we present Professor Little, I would just like to say a few words about Thrive Week. The idea of Thrive Week was first conceived at the University of British Columbia in the spring of 2009. This year, UBC invited Carleton to adopt the Thrive Week tradition. In fact, Carleton is among a group of 11 universities across Canada that has joined UBC in celebrating Thrive Week this week. The purpose of Thrive Week at Carleton has been to promote mental health awareness and start meaningful conversations related to mental health and well-being. In creating an awareness of mental health, perhaps it is important to first understand the definition of mental health. As per the World Health Organization, mental health is not merely the absence of mental illness. It is an essential resource for daily living and the foundation for effective functioning from cradle to grave, enabling people to experience life as meaningful and to be creative, productive members of society. We hope that Thrive Week has started the conversation around mental health and helped to make you aware of all those services that are provided on campus to foster your own effective mental health habits, services that are available year-round. And so, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Brian Little. As both a professor and acclaimed speaker, Brian Little is an expert on human personality and well-being. His pioneering research on how everyday personal projects and free traits influence our lives has become an important way of explaining and enhancing human flourishing. Professor Little is currently at Cambridge University, where he is a fellow of the Wellbeing Institute and director of the Social Ecology Research Group in the Department of Psychology. He is also affiliated with the Cambridge Judge Business School and the Psychometric Center at Cambridge. He has taught at McGill, Oxford, and Harvard universities, and is also a distinguished research professor emeritus at Carleton University. Most recently, Professor Little published a book titled Me, Myself, and Us, The Science of Personality and the Art of Well-Being, a book which is available today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Little.
What an absolute honor it is to be asked to wrap up Thrive Week. And what a delight to see a lot of old friends. Some it takes a second to recognize, but as soon as you speak, David, Marcy, I recognize. The voice perdures. Our visages sometimes crumble, but it's wonderful to be here. The other thing that excites me is that about a third of you, I think, are students. And about a third, maybe a quarter, but a goodly number of faculty, many from our distinguished psychology department. Bless your hearts for coming out. Your check will be in the mail. And then there are a whole bunch of administrators and technical people. These are the people, of course, who run Carleton. They don't let the professors know it, but we would not get anything done in the immortal profession if it weren't for your herding cats with dignity and style. And so my comments today are going to be directed to three constituencies. I want to make comments that may strike a resonant chord with our students here, with our faculty, and with our staff and administration. I'd also like to thank senior administration at Carleton for being so generous as to provide the books today. That was above and beyond what was required of support of a faculty, and it is deeply, deeply appreciated. So thanks for that. I like to speak extemporaneously. I don't like to speak from prepared notes. I essentially like to be PowerPointless. But one of the things that really struck me when I would go to graduations at Carleton is people would come up and say things like, "Oh, Professor Little, it was so nice to be in your class and I enjoyed it. And I really liked a particular lecture. And so I thought, for old time's sake, for some of you who did have me as students, I'm going to do a reprise of a particular lecture, but I'm going to cut it from an hour to 6 minutes. And there will be PowerPoints for that. But the real guide to me are a bunch of phrases, actually just single words, that popped up when I was thinking about this a couple of days ago. And I'm just going to tell you what those words are. The first is matches. The second is buttons. Third is avocados. Already you can see a coherent sense of where I'm going today. The fourth is niches. Fifth is quiet. Quack. And dancing. So if none of those strike you as interesting, please depart in peace. If any of them strike you as being moderately interesting, stay tuned. I can't guarantee that I will touch on each of them, but I will touch on some of them and try to craft them into my comments today. In the last chapter of Me, Myself, and Us, which I just abbreviate, and my wife Susan, we compress it into MOO, Me, Myself, and Us, MMU. So when I say in MOO, I'm not speaking of matters bovine, but I just like to abbreviate it. In MOO, in the final chapter, I begin by saying I'm at the stage of my academic career that is somewhere between full professor and total senility. And it means that at this stage of my career, which I call my anecdotage, I have an irrepressible desire to tell stories. And so my talk today is not going to be a series of points about elaborating a theoretical edifice for understanding thriving at Carleton. It's going to be some points, I hope of light, that illuminate some of the experiences I've had with students, with faculty, and with staff at Carleton. My hope is that they will end up creating a picture of how complex our personalities are, of how life is not always exciting and meaningful, but how in the end we endure and we have ways of coping and many, many sources of support at Carleton that will make things much better. The whole notion of Thrive Week is wonderful, and I'm delighted to contribute to it in a small way. So let me begin with matches. The field of personality psychology, which I have been working in for 4.5 decades, I guess, is one that looks at the ways in which we are like all other people, like some other people, and like no other person. And I think that that last one, the idiosyncratic singular you, is what I keep trying in the book to draw out. And yet, one of the most interesting things to individuals, and it was the source of the lecture that students most wanted to hear, is how you're like some other people, and particularly how you differ on what we now call the big 5 dimensions of personality. So this is a brief overview of the lecture that students come up afterwards and say, well, this is the one, I didn't remember any of your lectures, but this one. And I say, no, you didn't like the one where I did a multi-polynomial regression analysis that looked at the heteroskedasticity and prediction of outcome measures? And they said, no. So this is what they wanted. So here it is, abbreviated considerably. The big 5 dimensions of personality describe something that we can spell out as ocean, or if you're truly rural Canadian, canoe. The first is openness to experience. And I know some of you might have seen my TEDx talk, and so you may be familiar with this, but I do want to start this part of my presentation by telling you about an anatomical fact, that it is virtually impossible for adults to lick the outside of their own elbow. And then to say that how you responded to that piece of information probably tells us a great deal about your status on these big 5 dimensions of personality. Open to experience people have already said, well, how interesting. Those who are closed will say, the next one is conscientiousness. Conscientious people may not have licked their elbow, but they would have made a little note to themselves when get home. Check elbow anecdote. Okay. Extroverts have not only tried to lick their own elbow, they have successfully licked your elbow. And the introverts are still holding back a little bit. Agreeable individuals, they're such lovely people. They probably tried it, maybe dislocated something in the process. Disagreeable people are probably saying there is no conceivable way in which I am going to try to lick my elbow. And so they're resolutely committed to non-action in such frivolous activity. Neurotic individuals, perhaps they're wondering whether it's strange that they have been obsessed over the years with trying to lick their own elbow. And they're wondering, am I weird? Yes, very likely. But there's hope and help for you, because in part of Moo I talk about eccentrics. Here's to the eccentrics. Here's to the overly sensitive. Here to the ones who have flights of fancy when they're at Carleton. It isn't necessarily debilitating. The one that most students are interested in of the Big 5 is the extroversion dimension. This has been particularly popular as a topic since the publication of the book Quiet by Susan Cain. If you have a chance, buy Susan Cain's book. It's been at the top of the bestseller list for since 2012 when it came out, and it continues to be, I think, the world's #1 selling nonfiction book. If you buy it, do not read chapter 9. Okay. Promise me. Okay. Don't read chapter 9, because in that chapter, she talks about this strange little Carleton professor who went to Harvard for 5 years and who's been found hiding in the bathrooms to escape from the slings and arrows of outrageously extroverted students. So don't read that at all. But I will tell you a little bit about it in a few minutes. The extroversion dimension is interesting, and here is one of 2 slides that I'm really going to focus on. There are, within personality, perspectives which emphasize what I call our biogenic orientations. They have a bit of a genetic component to it, it's true. There are also perspectives that emphasize what I call a sociogenic aspect of the self. These are the cultural norms and rules and socially constructed habits that make our lives have some meaning and predictability. And then there are what I call idiogenic aspects of the human condition. These are the personal, singular projects in our lives that give meaning, that shape our life. And I think personality is significant for human well-being and thriving and flourishing in all of these aspects. And if we ignore the biogenic, we do ourselves a disservice. People have fidelity to their own first nature, as I call it. And if we ignore our second nature, our sociogenic, culturally prescribed aspects of our lives, I think we also do ourselves a disservice, because institutions and cultural traditions are things that enjoin us to act in ways that provide meaning not only for ourselves, but for others too. And the third, the sustainable pursuits of the projects that really matter to us, is what I and my students at Carleton studied for 20 years here, and we continue to study it in other universities, and some here in this room today at Carleton are still studying this aspect of personal projects and the idiogenic nature of human thriving. So let me get into some detail on the biogenic aspect of how we flourish, how we thrive, in terms of the dimension of personality, of extroversion in particular. One of the features of the mammalian brain is the neocortex, which is the part of the brain that allows us to think before acting, to prognosticate before engaging in mere behavior. But for the neocortex to function properly, it needs to be aroused or activated up to what we call an optimal level of arousal, or OLA. The optimal level of arousal is somewhere between, as you might expect, low levels, which would be regarded as something close to coma, and high, which would be regarded as frenetic activation. The interesting thing is that extroverts and introverts differ in their typical level of activation. I'm simplifying it considerably. But for our purposes today, it's helpful to think of extroverts, and this may be surprising to you, as being below the optimal level of stimulation, and introverts being over the optimal level. So that when we need, as extroverts, to function properly, we need to excite ourselves with something going on in the environment or by the ingestion of certain substances that will change level of arousal. Introverts, on the other hand, can be seen, and there are scales throughout the book where you can assess yourself on these dimensions of personality. Introverts are chronically over that optimal level, so for them to carry out their tasks and projects effectively, they need to gate or lower the level of stimulation in the surround. And consequently, they may be misconstrued by your department administrator, for example, as being antisocial, when in fact, they've learned over the years that they think better when they're off by themselves. And one of the great things about Susan Cain's book was that it is a passionate plea for the recognition of the needs and orientations of introverted people. And it started what's called a quiet revolution, loudly. Now, this has some very interesting implications for how we thrive at Carleton. If you're an extrovert, to thrive at Carleton, you need to take advantage of situations that get you aroused and activated. You need to take that risk and go into that activity that gives you a buzz, that gets that level of arousal up. If you're an introvert, you need to take advantage of the fabulous location of Carleton by the river and a canal. And don't feel guilty about going out, taking a walk by yourself. And I'll tell you a story about walking by a river in a few minutes. It's more subtle than simply matching your disposition to your activities. But that's part of it. That's where the match came in. Now, I usually go through some examples of how this applies to learning, performance. Extroverts do not do as well in the academic subjects at Carleton. The introverts do better by quite some bit. Now, why is this? Is it because introverts are more intelligent? No, it's not. There are no significant differences in IQ. So what's going on? I think what's going on is that the extroverts need something that introverts do not need as much, which is a sense of engagement. So a lecture that is engaging, that gets them involved, is better than one that is well organized and structured, and the latter is what the introverts crave. And they get ticked off when students ask questions in class because it's taking them off the well-structured ordering of the page. So as profs, and here my comments are directed to my beloved fellow colleagues, we need to design our lectures, I think, in such a way that they're engaging, but they're also well-structured. So the trade-off I've had to do today is I'm going to be free associating to a number of ideas rather than giving you a linear deconstruction of the idea in my head. But ideally, in our lectures, we should be catering to both of these. That's part of accommodation by matching diverse individuals in classrooms with our lecture material. There are ways in which you can get your level of arousal down and up by the ingestion of certain substances. Let's start with alcohol. And you may say, yes, please. Was it laid on, or was it just coffee that was laid on? Just coffee. Again, the bias towards extroversion is stunning in the world. Extroverts do better when they've ingested caffeine, to about the equivalent of 2.5 cups of coffee, in the performance on demanding tasks. Whereas introverts do relatively better when they have a central nervous system depressant. That gets their level of arousal down. Now, I am not suggesting to extroverts, that you have a couple of beer before you go into a final examination. There are other factors which override it. But it does help explain why extroverts, being under the optimal level of arousal when they have a couple of drinks, instead of being on the table dancing in convivial delight, are actually more at risk for being under the table. Whereas your introverted peers, on their way down to coma, which they will reach with sufficient ingestion, notice, pass through a zone in the middle where they're almost pleasant. Of course, they're also embarrassed about how extroverted they had been the day before. I will skip through the other things that I discussed, but you can see why the students resonate to this, because they can take it home and use it against their roommates. So one of the aspects of second natures that I'll just briefly allude to, and then I want to drift to some other topics, is nonverbal communication styles. We differ in the way we communicate. The nonverbal styles of extroverts and introverts, for example, 1 of 5, not the only dimension, 1 of 5, and there are 30 subdivisions or facets that we also need to know. But in this one, it's helpful to understand that it impacts the way we interact with others. Extroverts, when they interact, like to stand close for comfortable communication. They like to have a lot of body contact, usually unsolicited. They use more diminutive names. We found in research in England that the extroverts who meet somebody called Charles, they rapidly call him Charlie, and then Chuck, and then Chuckles baby. Whereas for introverts, it remains Charles until you're given a pass to be more intimate later on. When they get together, it can sometimes lead to really strange interactions. We call it the United Nations dance, where extroverts, to be polite, will move forward at cocktail parties, and introverts, to be polite, will move backwards. And it gives rise to a vector resolution problem, and which is not resolved by the introvert going bolt backwards, because that doesn't look very genial at a cocktail party. The resolution is mathematically and culturally brilliant. The introvert just goes in a continuing backward spiral motion until they get pinned in the corner being breathed upon by a lusty extrovert. And to the administrators here, you don't need to go to a cocktail party to see it. You see it in our offices at Carleton every day. The designated extrovert in your hallway pokes his head in your door and says, "Good morning!" And all the introverts stiffen and say, "Oh, God, he's going to hug us again." And he does. And it's not that introverts are against hugging. It's just that they have hierarchically organized designated huggers and huggies into which hierarchy he does not happen to fall. And it's not that extroverts are hustling or hassling. It's just that the bounds of conviviality that define his personal space extend in such a way as to include you and one muggy morning in the low building. There's this clash of personalities. And the point is that once you recognize this, as we've been doing here, it doesn't have to be odious. You can laugh. You can say, "Oh, God, there's David again. Come here, you big lug." Not that close. We speak differently. Now I have to confess something. I am as extreme off the scale as an introvert as you could find. I am a pseudo-extrovert. I love professing. I adore professing. It's a core project of my life. And I think if I were to lecture the way I do, let's say, in my graduate stats classes, I would be much more subdued. I'd be concentrating very heavily. I would speak more softly. And like many of you, we act out of character to advance certain projects that matter to us at the time. So you need to know that I'm really an introvert. Extroverts and introverts differ in their preferred way of communicating. Extroverts prefer black and white, concrete, simple language. Introverts prefer parenthetically complex, contingent, weasel word sentences, more or less, as it were. See, all of these are trailing, introverted clauses trying to extricate me from a proposition that may possibly be wrong. I had a colleague, Tom, who was as different from me as two people can be. First, his name was Tom, and mine's Brian. Secondly, he's 6'5". I have a tendency not to be. And thirdly, He's a card-carrying extrovert. I'm certifiably introverted, not certified in the psychiatric sense, but clearly and resolutely introverted. In terms of that arousal level, I can't have coffee after 3 in the afternoon and expect to sleep at night, for example. We had a consulting contract that involved having somebody from the finance department come in to our research team. And this person almost caused the whole thing to disintegrate. And the person who seconded him, we'll call him Michael, because that was his name. And they said, what do you make of Michael? And they said that to both Tom and to me. And Tom responded in classic extrovertese, remember, blunt, straightforward. And then they said to me, I'll tell you what he said in a second, and then they said to me, Brian, what do you make of Michael? And here's how we sound, if you're at all like me at Carleton, to extroverted ears. It's as though I said, well, Michael, at times, behaves in such a way as to appear to be more assertive than is normally seen, I think. And Tom just rolled his eyes and he said, Brian, that's what I said. He's an asshole. Now, as an introvert, I might gently allude to certain assholic qualities in this man's behavior, but I'm not going to lunge for the A word. But the extrovert says, if he walks like one, he talks like one, I call him one. And so do you see how these differences in personality can lead us to annoy each other, to cause consternation? But don't you see how wonderful it is to do what you've been doing, bless your hearts, which is laughing. I don't think you're laughing at anybody. I think we're laughing together at the strange ways in which we differ as human beings. I want to go back to my list of little prompts. We've done matching. We haven't done buttons. With buttons, I want to say a few words about what it's like to be a professor at Carleton and the challenges that can come. I gave a lecture on what we call, in those days, locus of control. There's a chapter in the book on this. And I've updated it to look at what we call human agency and the capacity to shape your own life. And some individuals are naturally disposed to thinking of themselves as a locus of change in their lives. Others are more reflective about the passive nature of their experience, that things happen to them, they do not make things happen. And in the course of this, I talked about the illusion of control. And I gave some experiments in which people were exposed to noise stressors, but in one condition, they had a button that they were told they could control the noise level, but please don't do it because, you know, we're studying the effect of noise on stress. And it turns out that nobody really pressed the button, but even though it was just, as it were, the illusion of control, they adapted faster and they did better in later tasks, and so on. So just the sense that you have control seems to have a positive effect upon your capacity to thrive and do well. I was lecturing on this, and somebody asked the question, you mentioned, Professor Little, that they actually ended up not even hooking it up after because nobody ever pressed it. What would have happened if somebody pressed the button, found that it wasn't hooked up? Wouldn't that be worse than thinking you never had control in the first place? I thought that was a really interesting question. There's actually a person who came in the back of the room, wasn't even in the class, but I said, are you a clinical psychologist? And he said, no. He said, I'm a political scientist. But that's my model of the Canadian political system. You think you have control with the buttons, but when you press it, nothing happens. So I was lecturing on this. And shortly after that, a couple of things happened that tested my sense of control over my life and the shape of things that will happen to me. I had been using in my class for years at Carleton what we call the personal sketch, where individuals write about their life and their own personality. And then as we go through the various topics of personality, go through the book, those were what we were discussing, those chapters, they would redefine, reconsider, reconstrue their life that they had written about in the first day of class? Is there any insight gained? Is there any new thoughts that you have that might lead you to shift or change or become even more what you were at the beginning of the class? And I asked people to write about this, and they were given complete freedom to write whatever they wanted. And I was reading a personal sketch. It was very quantitative, very mathematical, very good, because they could also write about the technical aspects of what they were studying. And the last entry said death threat. So I'm reading it. I thought, this isn't about heteroskedasticity in the predictor variable. It said, I've really enjoyed your courses, but I have an impulse welling in me that makes me want to take the gun that my brother-in-law gave me at Christmas time and shoot you right between your beady little eyes. Do not walk by the Rideau River. My gun is cocked. I read this. I'm still here. But I'm embarrassed to tell you what my first reaction was. My first reaction was, what do you mean, beady little eyes? I didn't think they were unduly beady. And I guess it was just too painful to actually consider. It ended up, but the impact on my students was fascinating to watch. The students in my lab, first of all, I wouldn't tell people who the student was who had written this. It ended up being a hoax. I'm not sure of the motives behind it. But the students, when they found out that there may be a shooting in the lab, said things like, hey, Brian, you know those letters of recommendation you were writing? Can you sort of speed it up a little bit? So all of this led to an awareness that I had of the contingency of life. I had hitherto been extremely internal, extremely agential. And it, for me, solidified the need to check to make sure your buttons are hooked up. That the spouse you think loves you forever and unreservedly really does still love you because you haven't talked for 3 years. That your health really is under your control and that something insidious hasn't intervened beyond your awareness. And so it makes us, I think, more sensitive to life's contingencies. And I'd lectured on this. And after the class, a guy from architecture came up to me. This was at Carleton. And he said, I'm going to do a journal entry on this lecture. I guess it would have been the day before. I did a journal entry on your lecture. Check the door in your office. So I thought, okay. I was going out to the parking lot. I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. He was a fun kid. And I went up there. And I'm going to read this because I want to get it precisely correct. He said, in the previous lecture, I told them about experiments on stress. A tall, lanky, curly-haired guy came up after class, slipped me a note, added another one saying, check your office door. So I headed up to my office in the Loeb building, 5th floor. There hanging from the door was a cigar box with wires coming out of it and a big brass button that had written on it, press me and see what happens. Now, I don't think of myself as a deeply stupid man, but it never really dawned on me that there was anything dangerous about this at all. I thought it was a clever way of symbolizing the lecture the students had recently heard, so I chuckled and then headed off. The security staff at Carleton, in their wisdom, remembered the events of the previous month, the death threat. And from what I could tell from the residents of that corner of my building the next day, these custodians of campus safety did not chuckle. The following morning, I went up the elevator to my office, and as soon as the door opened, I saw my dean and the head of security waiting to intercept me. They proceeded to tell me that everything was okay now, but that there had been an incident overnight at my office. Apparently, security had seen the cigar box, button, and wires, and they had alerted the police. They came with a bomb squad and blew up my door. Got 'em good, said the head of security. I'm not entirely sure I will ever understand the logic of demolishing my door, but the whole event seems symbolically expressive of the surreal month I just experienced. I was able to rescue the cigar box with its big brass button, and I've stored it away as one of my prized possessions. It reminds me of the potential perils of professing and the strange complexity of seemingly simple buttons, both real and metaphorical. I want to say a word about niches. As an introvert who loves to profess with passion, because I adore my subject and I adore my students, I have to act as a pseudo-extrovert. And some of the best research in the world, not done by me incidentally, is done here at Carleton on the capacity of individuals to act in ways that go against their natural dispositions. People being pseudo-introverts for an afternoon or pseudo-extroverts. I have a particular take on this. It's still early days as far as the empirical research is concerned, but I have reasons to believe that the following happens. We act out of character. I act extrovertedly. Some of you who are naturally agreeable people may have acted disagreeably because you have tried to take care of an injustice that happened when you were trying to get care for your mom. And so for all of October, you've been pushing and pushing and pushing, acting in a disagreeable way in order to advance a core project of taking care of mom. So I think we act out of character for two reasons: for professionalism and out of love. The projects that matter dearly to us will enjoin us to act in ways that advance those projects, even if we have to act out of character. Now, how long we have to act out of character before it becomes dangerous for us, we still don't know. But I suspect if you've been doing it for months, that's going to extract a change. We desperately need longitudinal studies of this to be sure that something is happening. But I want to give you the example of what I used to do and what I still do. And I'm going to do it in 17 minutes, 12 seconds as an escape strategy after having been a pseudo-extrovert for an hour. Some of you are like me. I'm not rare at all. Many of you are the same as I am. As the administrators or professors or in your departments, you act out of character because it's a professional requirement. As students, you act out of character because you're a raging extrovert. But you sit in class for 4 hours a day, you take notes, you grind it out, and you do it because it matters to you. It's a core project in your life. I used to go down to the Department of National Defense in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, Quebec. A Carleton student arranged this for me the first time. He was in the Army, he was a major, and he thought some of the lectures would be really relevant to colonels who are about to become generals and who were really interested in understanding people's personalities. Sort of surprised me. And so I would lecture for 3 hours in the morning and then 2.5 hours in the afternoon. It was pretty exhausting because you got 48 eyes staring at you. We know that eye contact alone increases arousal considerably in the neocortex. So that's not good for me to have all those eyes. Like if I suddenly look at somebody now, right? That arousal level, woo, way up. Psst, psst. So they wanted me to go to the officers' mess at lunchtime. And I would have been a mess if I'd gone, so I begged off. And I said, I'm going to walk by the Richelieu River because my cover story was, because I want to look at the boats. All I wanted to do was to lower my level of neocortical arousal. 2 beers would have done the same thing. But I wanted to be coherent and give a lucid talk in the afternoon. So I did this for a number of years, but then the campus moved, and the river stayed where it was. So I had to find another place to go. And there's one 43 paces from this podium, which is the men's washroom. And I'm going to show you that men's washroom. It's right here. You're looking down on it. It's a plan view, so if you're used to looking down on men's washrooms. The top of the cubicles on the side are the urinals. It was a very busy urinal day. All the extroverts were gathering there. I went as far away as any introvert will to the furthest 8th cubicle, I think it was. and began to lower my level of neocortical arousal. But then one of the things as introverts we're very good at is spotting predators. Extroverts spot prey. We spot predators. And one of the best predators for introverts to be aware of and wary about are real extroverts. And I heard one coming in a way that is very distinctively extroverted. Ba-bum, ba-ba-bum. Comes in, kicks open the door. He's about to go into cubicle 2. I'm looking underneath and spot his feet. He must have seen and recognized my non-military purchase feet. Well, shoes. And then he started getting closer and closer and closer. He said, bum, ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Cubicle 7. My heart's going boom, ba-bum, ba-bum. I hear, how to put this felicitously, various evacuatory noises, utterly unmuffled. We hate that as introverts. We don't even like our own. That's why we flush during as well as after. And then I heard this gravelly voice saying, "Hey, is that Dr. Little?" If anything is guaranteed to constipate an introvert for 6 months, it's talking on the John. So what I do now, as a pseudo-extrovert trying to muddle through life in its vicissitudes, when I go to the washroom, I put my feet up. And I swear one of these days a real extrovert's going to come underneath and say, "Gotcha!" That will be the day I die. Now, I do want to go back to some of my little quack. I don't want to duck that one. Oh, forgive me. Some of you may know my wife has been at Carleton all these years. She was the director of the School of Public Policy, Susan Phillips. And I told her not to come today because I'd be telling stories about her. And she's magic and golden and keeps me sane. There was a day when I really needed that succorance because, again, the vicissitudes of life at Carleton can be really quite intriguing. I had been asked by my dean if I would go through, with another faculty member, every department of the university and get them to establish criteria for what was working in their courses for accountability, communication, decision-making, all these things. I said, "Are you serious? I'd prefer rectal surgery without a general anesthetic to doing that." To which my dean said, "That can also be arranged, Professor Little." So I thought, oh my gosh, and I'd written a report on we'd better do it before the government does it. And I got an email. My wife, Susan, always says, "Don't read your email at nighttime." And I do, always, and I shouldn't. And so I had an email came, bing. It was from a professor in a department I won't even name here because he may actually be here today. And I don't want you to look at him. But the email said, "Little, I have read your report and I am appalled at your recommendations. We shall fight at the general faculty meeting tomorrow. Yours." Lizzie didn't say, "I read your beady-eyed little report," but it almost had that same impact. And so I thought, Susan said to me, "Darling, are you a little stressed tonight?" We'd gone to bed. And I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, you're standing up in bed." And I go, "Yeah," I said, and I told her about the letter. I thought, oh, geez, this is going to be, I don't like conflict very much. So she said, "Well, why don't you use that technique that you used to teach your students of thought stopping, which is where you think of something, you consciously say, 'Stop.' And it obliterates what you were thinking about for a moment, but then you can draw upon that." It's a well-known cognitive behavior modification technique. So I said, "Hey, that's great, thank you. But I know it too well, so I have to have a prompt word." She said, "Well, why don't you think of yourself as a duck with water coming off your back and say quack?" And I thought, you're brilliant, even for a political scientist. And so I did. I went into this. The first thing I did was I said, "Professor X is appalled by my report. I'm saying to myself, and I wasn't getting anxious about it. And I think he deserves to be heard before I say another word. So please, stand up. And he stood up, and he was sort of a little bit confused that I'd invited him to do this. So I went, and then I was well into my quacking success when a prof from no, I won't say which department, was having a little exchange with another prof and said something that the other one didn't understand. So I said, I think what Professor Y is saying, and he whipped around and he said to me, Professor Little, when I want my words clarified, I'll ask to have them clarified. So I thought, quack, 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 quack. And so I thought, this is a very, very good strategy. It's working as a subvocal adaptation response. Alas, it wasn't subvocal. It came out as quack. This is the God's total truth. And he then went around again because he was facing the other direction. He said, Brian, did you just quack? And then I engaged in the most ludicrous extrication procedure you can imagine. I faked that I was coughing. This was not my finest moment at Carleton. And finally, I want to say a couple of words, because I know some of you need to get back to your department. So I'll just wrap up now with something that matters to me. That when I was talking after class, or actually even before class to my students, and I'd say, so how are you? They'd usually say, fine. And that's great. But then I just stumbled on one day by saying, no, really. And the transformation occurs when you say, no, really. All of a sudden, their boyfriend leaving to go to Ryerson, or their parents divorcing, or why is it that statistics is designed to rip my very soul out of me, started flooding out. And so and those were the early days at Carleton when I really began to love my students and to see what was happening in their lives. And so I tried something once, and I kept doing it since. And it was at the end of my classes, the end of the course, I would read out something that at first I thought was too heavy for the students. And now I realize it isn't, because it's a joyful message, but it's a tricky one. It's a very poignant one. And the first time I read it out to my wife, I started to tear up. And I did because I realized that it was hitting right at the heart of how we sometimes act out of character to pursue personal projects that matter dearly to us. And we may not recognize that self we have been enacting because it seems so strange and alien. And so there was a philosopher who has Owen Flanagan is his name, who wrote a very serious and very scholarly book called Self-Expressions, but it was his last chapter that was an epilogue that was only 2 pages. And I'm just going to read a small section from it that I have in the last section of the book. He talks about the reconciliation of self with self, of you, the I, the thinking me, with the person you are enacting in your everyday lives. And he's arguing that maybe we should have a dance with ourselves, and to save the last dance for me. So he's talking about what happens at the end of life. But the joyous news is you can do this 23 minutes from now in your classrooms, is to be gentle with yourself, to revitalize yourself and reconcile yourself to yourself. He ends with an invocation to his self. If you read it slowly, out loud, it could be mistaken for poetry. Darling self, that's a wonderful invocation. It is inevitable, but it's also my wish that you save the last dance for me. Never mind the clumsiness, we know each other well by now, and let's hope that value is detected as we embrace. But it should be more than mere infatuation. It should really matter. This life, should really mean something. Respect should be warranted. It will be good to feel peace of mind, to be comfortable, to sense integrity and effort, and to recognize that we have had some fun. Remember, if anyone knows you, really remembers and knows you, especially how you dance, it is me. Me, myself, and I. Cha-cha-cha. My final paragraph in the book, and one that really matters in the context of Thrive Week and the resources that are available, the us that you yourself can turn to at Carleton, reads like this. There should be other people who have mattered to us along the way that are included in this dance. The ones who shape our expectations, support our ventures, and love us in spite of ourselves. So here's to you yourself, by all means. But also, here's to us, your fellow travelers in life, who help shape your personality, promote your well-being, laugh at your jokes, and hold you tight when you most need it. Thank you.